The first war in Elder Scrolls history wasn't fought over land or gold or politics. It was fought over whether the universe should be legal, and the universe lost. The El-Nofe War tore continents apart, created the oceans you sail in every game, and ended with the gods ripping out Lorkhan's heart for starting it all. Then they used that same heart as the load-bearing pillar of reality, starting with the conflict that made Tamriel exist in the first place, the El-Nofe War. The El-Nofe War predates recorded history entirely. It happened during the Dawn Era, when the progenitors of all mortal races still walked an undivided Nirn before time itself worked properly. This wasn't armies clashing over resources. It was a reality accident that split existence into competing factions and never fully healed. The conflict divided the El-Nofe into two groups, the Old El-Nofe, proto-ancestors of the Mer, and the Wandering El-Nofe, proto-ancestors of men. The Old El-Nofe wanted stasis, divine order, a world that stayed close to what existed before mortality. The Wandering El-Nofe embraced change, chaos, the unpredictability of a flawed creation. They fought over territory, yes, but more fundamentally, they fought over whether mortal existence should be allowed to continue at all. The physical aftershock tore Nirn apart entirely. Tamriel, Atmora, Yokuda, and Akavir formed as raw land was sundered by forces that rewrote geology. Newly created oceans separated the factions, which may have been the only thing that stopped the war from running forever. Men were driven to Atmora in defeat. Mer held Tamriel. The war ended at an event called the Convention. The gods captured Lorkhan and removed his heart as punishment for creating the flawed mortal plane. This act imposed linear time on the chaotic Dawn Era, turning myth time into history time. Here's where it gets weird. The gods punish Lorkhan by ripping out his heart, yet that same heart becomes the load-bearing pillar of reality itself. It gets discovered millennia later by the Dwemer, used to build a god machine called Numidium, and then reactivated by Tiber Septim to conquer Tamriel. The thing they removed to stabilize the world becomes the thing every future civilization tries to weaponize. Turns out, you can't separate creation from the crime of creation. The Wandering El-Nofe's descendants later returned to Tamriel as the Needies, eventually giving rise to Imperials, Reachmen, and Bretons. Men have been framed as late arrivals in a land elves remember as theirs by divine right ever since. But if you think a war that literally created continents is disturbing, wait until you hear about the one where mortals invented a weapon that forces immortal gods to experience death, the Dragon War. Alduin didn't lose the Dragon War because the ancient Nords outfought him. He lost because three heroes figured out something nobody else had. You can't kill a god by stabbing it harder. You have to make it doubt itself first. Here's the thing about dragons in Elder Scrolls lore. They don't just have a different philosophy about time, they literally experience it differently to mortals. Where you and I see time as a line, a sequence of before and after, dragons perceive all of it at once. Past, present, future, all happening simultaneously. This isn't a metaphor. It's a fundamental property of their existence. And it's also exactly why killing Alduin with conventional weapons was never going to work. You can't end something that doesn't believe endings apply to it. So the three heroes, Gormleth Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old, did something genuinely unprecedented. They invented a new Thuum specifically designed to exploit this weakness. Dragonrend didn't deal damage. It didn't burn anything. What it did was force Alduin to experience mortality, to feel time as a linear, finite thing for just a moment, like grabbing something that has never known cold and holding its hand in ice water. The dragon couldn't function properly under that concept. It was a philosophical weapon, which is honestly not a sentence you expect to write about a game where people also eat entire wheels of cheese in one sitting. But here's where it gets complicated. Even Dragonrend wasn't enough to finish the job. Alduin was still technically unkillable, and the three heroes knew it. Feldir the Old had been carrying an Elder Scroll as a contingency plan, and after a genuine argument about whether using it was a good idea, Hakon and Gormleth both thought it was insane for the record, Feldir used it to cast Alduin forward through time. Not defeated, not destroyed, just delayed. The ancient Nords essentially solved the apocalypse by making it someone else's problem, specifically yours, thousands of years later, which is, not ideal. This is what makes the Dragon War so much more interesting than a simple good versus evil founding myth. The heroes didn't win cleanly. They won on a technicality, bought on credit, with the full understanding that eventually the bill would come due. The entire political and cultural identity of Skyrim, the reverence for the voice, the founding of the Greybeards, the existence of the Dragonborn prophecy, all of it exists as infrastructure built around the fact that the original solution was temporary and Everyone involved knew it. The throat of the world wasn't just a battlefield, it was the site of the most consequential punt in human history, the War of the First Council. The First Council sounds like one of those boring political bodies that gets a plaque in a museum and nobody reads it. It wasn't. It was a pragmatic military alliance between two peoples who absolutely despised each other, and when it collapsed, it took an entire species with it. The First Council formed in 1E 416 between the Dwemer and the Khmer, ancestors of the modern Dunmer, specifically to drive the Nords out of Resdine. It worked. Then everyone pretended the massive philosophical gulf between atheist engineer dwarves and religious zealot dark elves wasn't going to be a problem. Spoiler, it was a problem. The alliance held for almost 300 years. Then Highcraft Lord Kagranak discovered the heart of Lorkhan beneath Red Mountain and decided to use it to power Numidium, a brass god machine built to achieve Dwemer apotheosis. The Khmer houses viewed this as the most profane thing imaginable. The First Council fractured along religious lines, with Nord and Orc mercenaries drawn in for land and plunder, because of course they were. What makes this war brilliant is that every betrayal is morally defensible from inside its own logic. The Dwemer were atheist rationalists trying to transcend mortality on their own terms. The Khmer were protecting the sanctity of existence from an experiment that could unmake the world. Both sides thought they were righteous. Both sides were arguably correct. The war culminated at the Battle of Red Mountain circa 1E 700. Mid-battle, every single Dwemer vanished from the mortal plane. Not dead, not evacuated, gone. Their cities and automatons stood empty, but every living Dwemer simply ceased to exist. Kagranak's final use of the tools on the heart either ascended them, annihilated them, or turned them into something so alien that existence no longer applied. It's one of Elder Scrolls' greatest unsolved mysteries, and it will never be fully answered because the ambiguity is the point. Nerevar, the Khmer king who led the Orthodox side, died shortly after under circumstances that are, let's say, disputed. Temple propaganda says he died of his wounds. Ashlander oral tradition says his three counselors, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil, murdered him to steal the heart's power. Both versions exist simultaneously as true within Elder Scrolls' mythopoeic framework, because history in this setting is written by gods with every reason to lie. In the power vacuum after Nerevar's death, the tribunal broke their sworn oath and used Kagranak's tools on the heart to absorb its divine essence. 3 mortals became living gods and ruled Morrowind for the next 3,000 years. The Temple calls it reluctant necessity. The Ashlanders call it murder and blasphemy. Neither side can prove their case, which is exactly how the tribunal wanted it. But if you think one species vanishing and 3 mortals becoming gods is strange, wait until you hear about the time every race in Tamriel built a single navy and sank an entire continent to stop a magical plague, the All Flags Alliance War. Around 1E 2200, the Sload of Thras unleashed a magical plague on Tamriel that killed millions. The Thracian plague wiped out vast swathes of the population across Cyrodiil, High Rock, and beyond, decimating entire cities and leaving corpses piled in the streets. The Sload, slug-like necromancers whose home was an island continent in the Abyssian Sea, had either engineered the plague as a weapon or allowed it to spread through their own vile experiments. Either way, the peoples of Tamriel decided the only acceptable response was total annihilation, so they built the All Flags Navy. Bretons, Imperials, Redguards, Nords, and multiple elven kingdoms, all of whom had been killing each other for centuries, stopped their own wars, pooled their fleets, and sailed together under a single banner to erase the Sload from existence. This was the first time in recorded history that Tamriel's fractious races cooperated on anything, let alone a campaign of deliberate genocide. The fleet sailed to Thras, assaulted the Sload homeland with overwhelming magical and military force, and sank the entire island continent beneath the sea. The Sload civilization was shattered. Most of them died. The survivors scattered into hidden enclaves and never regained their former power. But here's where it gets complicated. The Sload murdered millions with a magical plague, so Tamriel responded by committing an environmental and magical atrocity so extreme it reshaped ocean currents across the western seas. They didn't just defeat the Sload, they drowned an entire continent. This constitutes one of the most extreme acts of magical violence in Elder Scrolls history, rivaling even the El-Nofe War's tectonic rifts. The question nobody in universe seems to ask is whether the cure was as bad as the disease. Politically, the All Flags moment set a precedent. It proved that Tamriel's races could unite against existential threats when the alternative was extinction. This template echoes in later responses to Oblivion crises and Daedric invasions, but it also normalized total war logic in the setting. Survival, purchased at enormous moral cost. The plague's population population losses, and the war's economic disruption likely weakened regional powers enough to create the power vacuums later filled by the Alessian and Riemann empires. What's certain is that the sinking of Thrace altered trade routes, reshaped coastlines, and removed a major maritime menace, leaving the seas safer for human and elven shipping, but at the price of an entire sapient species. Evidence quality for this war is moderate to thin. The existence of the Thracian plague, the All-Flags Navy, and the sinking of Thrace are well attested in canon, but the war's detailed course and exact casualties are not richly documented. What we know for sure is that Tamriel's peoples united once, sailed together, and committed an act of magical genocide so thorough that the Slode never recovered. Whether that was justice or murder depends on who you ask, and the game never gives you a clear answer. But if you think sinking a continent is the worst thing Tamriel's ever done, wait until you hear about the guy who conquered the entire world using a god machine that breaks reality itself. The Tiber War, Tiber Septim unified the world and guaranteed it would eventually tear itself apart. That's his legacy. He conquered Tamriel with a god machine fueled by a dead god's heart, became a god himself, and gave the elves a theological grudge that will outlast his entire empire. The Tiber War started around 2E 854 and lasted 42 years. That's longer than most empires exist, let alone wars. By the time it ended, Tamriel stood united under one emperor for the first time since the Riemann dynasty collapsed centuries earlier. The Second Era's interregnum chaos was over, and it only took 4 decades of blood, fire, and reality-warping weapons to get there. Tiber Septim himself, also known as Hjalti Earlybeard, Talos Stormcrown, and Eismir depending on who you ask, was a dragonborn, dragon soul in a mortal body. He rose to power under Emperor Kulakain, helped conquer the imperial city around 2E 854, and then Kulakain mysteriously died. Suspicious death, widely implied to be assassination. Tiber emerged as sole ruler immediately after. Convenient. From there, it's 42 years of systematic conquest. High Rock fell easily, described in multiple sources as practically handing itself over because the province was so politically fragmented. Dozens of petty kingdoms bickering over scraps after the Riemann Empire collapsed. The interregnum's chaos was its own undoing. Tiber's legions rolled through because there was no unified resistance, just a patchwork of feudal lords who couldn't organize a defense if their lives depended on it, which they did. But here's where it gets interesting. Tiber didn't even plan to invade Somerset until he had Numidium. That tells you everything about Altmeri magical superiority, the most powerful elven civilization on Nirn, the birthplace of magic. The culture that views itself as the closest thing to divinity on the mortal plane could only be conquered by deploying a walking god machine built from the corpse of another god, Numidium, the same brass god that Kagrenac engineered using the heart of Lorkhan during the War of the First Council. The Dwemer tried to use Lorkhan's heart to make themselves into gods. It destroyed them. Tiber secured the machine through complex deals and manipulations in Morrowind, powered it up, and pointed it at Somerset. The deployment of Numidium caused reality-altering side effects, dragon breaks, timeline distortions, in-universe explanations for why the historical record of exactly how Tiber won certain battles becomes incoherent and contradictory. Multiple timelines overlapping, events that happened and didn't happen simultaneously. The Altmer never forgave him. After Tiber's death, he was deified as Talos, one of the 9 divines, an act that outraged Altmer across Somerset because divinity is supposed to be an elven birthright, not something a human can just take. That ideological wound never healed. It festered for centuries. It planted the seed for the Great War. It's why the Skyrim Civil War exists. Everything bad in the Fourth Era traces back to this war. Kagrenac tried to use Lorkhan's heart to make Dwemer into gods. It destroyed them. Tiber used the machine Kagrenac built to make himself a god. The elves never forgave him. That's the thread. That's the connection. The Tiber War didn't just unify Tamriel. It guaranteed Tamriel's future fracture the moment Tiber ascended to godhood. If you think using a reality-warping god machine to crush an entire province sounds bad, wait until you hear about the war that almost ends the empire entirely, the Great War. The Great War wasn't just a military conflict. It was a psychological operation disguised as peace negotiations, and the empire walked right into it. From 4E 171 to 4E 175, the Third Empire, already weakened by the loss of the Septim bloodline and decades of internal decay, faced the Aldmeri Dominion in what the Thalmor themselves called the First War against the Empire. Not the war, the First War. They signed the peace treaty, knowing they'd be back. On the 30th of Frostfall, 4E 171, the Dominion's ambassador arrived at the imperial city with a gift for Emperor Titus Mede II, a cart full of severed heads. Every single one belonged to a Blades operative caught in Somerset. Then came the ultimatum: massive tributes, disbandment of the Blades, outlawing of Talos worship, and the cession of large sections of Hammerfell. Titus rejected the terms. The Thalmor had counted on it. By 4E 172, Dominion forces had captured Breville and Anvil and advanced to the walls of the imperial city itself. The Empire wasn't fighting for expansion or glory. It was fighting for survival within its own heartland, with legions overstretched, supply lines broken, and the capital surrounded while Hammerfell burned in a separate theater. The Battle of the Red Ring in 4E 175 changed the tactical picture, but not the strategic reality. Titus II launched a daring counteroffensive, pulling legions back from Hammerfell to encircle and annihilate the main Dominion army in Cyrodiil. Imperial forces retook the imperial city and inflicted catastrophic losses on the Thalmor, turning what looked like inevitable defeat into a stunning battlefield victory. And it changed nothing. Late in 4E 175, Titus signed the White Gold Concordat. The treaty banned Talos worship across the Empire, disbanded the Blades, and ceded occupied sections of Hammerfell to the Dominion. The Empire had just won the biggest battle of the war and still agreed to every single demand the Thalmor had made 4 years earlier. The Empire kept its borders. It surrendered its soul. Hammerfell refused. The Red Guards renounced their ties to the Empire and kept fighting alone, eventually forcing a Dominion withdrawal. But the precedent was set. The Empire would abandon its own provinces to appease the Thalmor. The Talos ban is the real story. The Thalmor didn't just want territory. They wanted to make the Empire outlaw its own god. Talos is the human who became divine, the proof that mortality isn't a curse, the symbol of everything the Empire claims to stand for. By forcing the Empire to criminalize his worship, the Thalmor drove a knife between Nord and Imperial identity and left it there to fester. Thalmor justiciars now roam Skyrim arresting citizens for praying, and the Empire enforces it. The Concordat didn't end the war. It weaponized religious oppression as occupation by proxy. The Thalmor named it the First War against the Empire because they already know there will be a second one, and the Empire will be even weaker when it comes. But if you think signing away your religion and abandoning your allies is the worst way a war can end, wait until you see what happens when that resentment turns into a civil war inside the province that revered Talos most. The Skyrim Civil War. The Skyrim Civil War is a conflict where both sides are right and both sides are catastrophically wrong, which is why nobody can agree on it 16 years after the game came out. It starts in 4E 201, directly because of the White Gold Concordat. The Empire agreed to ban Talos worship to end the Great War, and Skyrim, where Talos is basically a patron saint of Nordic identity, was told to shut up and comply. The Nords did not shut up. They complied even less. The actual spark that lit the fuse was the Markarth incident. After the Great War, Ulfric Stormcloak helped the Empire retake the Reach from the Forsworn, with the implicit promise that Talos worship would be restored there as payment. When the Thalmor found out and protested, the Empire arrested Ulfric instead of honoring the deal, because the Empire was more afraid of the Thalmor than it was of its own war heroes. Ulfric, understandably, took this personally. Years later, Ulfric challenges High King Torrig to single combat under ancient Nord tradition. Torrig knows he's going to lose, but he accepts anyway, because refusing would brand him a coward for the rest of his life. Ulfric kills him with the Thuum, the voice, a shout so powerful it literally tears Torrig apart. Whether this was a legitimate succession challenge or just murder by magic scream is the fault line the entire war is built on. Ulfric's supporters call it rightful Nordic tradition. His enemies call it an execution dressed up as honor. Roughly half of Skyrim's Jarls sided with Ulfric and declared for independence. The other half stayed loyal to the Empire, arguing that a fractured human alliance is exactly what the Thalmor want, and that Skyrim can't survive alone against the inevitable Second Great War. Both arguments are correct. That's the problem. Here's where it gets worse. The Thalmor's documented strategy, found in their own dossiers, is to keep the civil war going indefinitely. They don't want either side to win. Every Stormcloak sword strike and every Imperial arrest weakens the collective strength of men without the Dominion risking a single soldier. Ulfric thinks he's fighting for Nordic freedom. The Empire thinks attacks, it's preserving unity. The Thalmor are winning both arguments by letting them fight. And then, on the exact same day, the war reaches its breaking point with Ulfric's planned execution at Helgen. Alduin returns to Nirn and attacks the town, interrupting the beheading and releasing both Ulfric and the last Dragonborn into the world. The Dragon War's unresolved temporal debt, shunted forward by an Elder Scroll thousands of years earlier, comes due at the precise moment Skyrim's political order collapses. The two crises collide on the same morning. That's not coincidence. That's cosmically entangled. The game lets you pick a side. You can help the Stormcloaks drive the Empire out of Skyrim and restore Talos worship. Or you can help the Imperials crush the rebellion and preserve the fragile unity needed to face the Dominion. There is no canonical victor. Both endings are equally valid in the lore, and later Fourth Era sources have deliberately avoided resolving the outcome. The Skyrim Civil War is the only conflict on this list that is still formally unfinished, still open, still being argued about in living memory, and in forum threads to this day. If you think the Aldmeri Dominion quietly orchestrating a reality-collapsing Daedric invasion while mortals tore each other apart over a ruby throne was bad, at least Molag Bal had the decency to show up in person. The Plainmeld. Every war on this list fought over who gets to rule Tamriel. The Plainmeld fought over whether Tamriel gets to exist as a concept. Molag Bal wasn't invading the world. He was filing a change of address form for the entire planet, moving it from Mundus straight into Hell. The Plainmeld occurred around 2E 579 through 582 during the Interregnum, when three mortal factions were so busy stabbing each other for the Ruby Throne that a Daedric prince nearly dragged the whole continent into Cold Harbor, his personal dimension of infinite torment. The operation was enabled by the Soul Burst, the catastrophic misuse of the Amulet of Kings that shattered the barrier between Mundus and Oblivion. With that barrier cracked open, Molag Bal deployed dark anchors across the continent, massive rune-inscribed chains descending from the sky, functioning simultaneously as invasion portals and metaphysical harpoons literally dragging Nirn toward Cold Harbor. Here's where it gets weird. The Plainmeld operated on two simultaneous levels. There was the visible part, a military Daedric invasion that mortals could fight with swords and spells. And then there was the invisible part, an ontological process of planar fusion that no army could stop. Mortals weren't just at risk of death or enslavement. They were at risk of being metaphysically redefined as denizens of Cold Harbor entirely. The dark anchors weren't portals in the traditional sense. They were hooks. Molag Bal was literally fishing for a planet. The three mortal factions, the First Aldmeri Dominion, the Ebonheart Pact, and the Daggerfall Covenant, were simultaneously fighting their own alliance war over Cyrodiil, a political conflict the Plainmeld exploited as perfect cover. While the alliances burned each other's soldiers and argued over who deserved the throne's dimension of existence was being ripped out from under them. Three factions grinding themselves into the dirt over a crown, completely oblivious that the ground itself was being yanked into another plane of reality. The Plainmeld was ultimately prevented by the Vestige, a soul-shriven hero whose stolen soul gave them a unique metaphysical link to Cold Harbor. They traveled directly into Cold Harbor and defeated Molag Bal's avatar, severing the chains and collapsing the merger before it reached the point of no return. But even after the Plainmeld's closure, many dark anchors remained physically present in the world, suggesting Nirn's connection to Oblivion was permanently altered. And the Alliance War? It ended with no clear winner. The three factions collapsed into exhaustion and political vacuums. In a grim irony, the Plainmeld's failure directly created the conditions Tiber Septim would exploit centuries later to unify Tamriel. The alliances spent so much blood and treasure fighting each other and defending against Molag Bal that none of them had the strength left to resist a charismatic conqueror with a god machine. The Daedric prince, who tried to merge the world into hell, accidentally set the table for the greatest human empire in Tamriel's history. So it just goes to show, every war in Elder Scrolls is a war about the nature of reality itself. From the El Nofe splitting continents in the Dawn era, to Molag Bal dragging Nirn toward oblivion, from the Thalmor banning a god to Ulfric Stormcloak shouting a king to death, these conflicts don't just change borders. They rewrite the metaphysical rules. And that's what makes Elder Scrolls lore unlike anything else in fantasy. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.